Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to my first attempt at doing a live stream. The old dog is learning some new tricks. So I will see you here. And if you have any questions or anything that you want to ask me, now's the time to do it because I'm right here and I can answer your questions live here on YouTube. I wanted to say a little bit more at the beginning about my hearing aids. The last video that I posted, I talked about how I had to get hearing aids. Turns out I was starting to lose my hearing, especially in the upper registers. And so I got my hearing tested, and then I learned that my hearing was deteriorating, just like my eyesight, apparently. But now I'm wearing my hearing aids, and here's the irony: I'm a professional musician, as many of you know, and I've played live music probably since the early 70s, but I never played in a loud rock band. The whole time I've been playing live, I never played loud music. In fact, loud music, it caused me physical pain. I remember going to a wedding reception when I was a little kid. My parents took me to a wedding reception, and the band was really loud. And I can't remember exactly how old I was. I was 7, 8 years old, and I started bawling. And I just said, "Get me out of here!" My poor parents had to take me out because the music was so loud. And to this day, I just can't stand super loud music. Whenever I go to a concert, and I've gone to see Sting and Paul Simon and Fleetwood Mac and a few of the big names, Elton John, Billy Joel, if they're playing really loud, I've got to just either just endure it because I like the music or maybe put in some earplugs. But that was one of the first questions that the audiologist asked me was, did you play loud music? Because I told her I was a musician. I said, no, when I was in a society band in the 90s, we had to play quietly, especially during dinner. And as I mentioned in a YouTube short, we even had a manager come up to us and say, can you turn it down a little bit? They can still hear you, which we did. And we just basically were playing for ourselves at that time. And then later on, I was working with Sybil Gage, a New Orleans jazz singer, and wonderful 10 years working with her. But a lot of times we was just the two of us, piano and vocal. And so naturally, we were never going to be super, super loud. The only time we ever really got loud was when we were playing Mardi Gras. And that was always a lot of fun, but I was always kind of glad we didn't do that every week because we had to play pretty loud for a crowd like that. Anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about how this whole thing, how At Home with Music got started. I don't know if I've ever told this story on YouTube, but we can kind of divide our lives these days into what I call BP and AP, before pandemic and after pandemic. We moved here in Asheville. We moved here to Asheville in 2016, and at that point, I was largely retired from live performing. We had the opportunity to be part of the worship band at church, and I was doing some recording in my studio. Not only do I do videos here, but I also produce music, which is one of the reasons I'm glad I've got hearing aids now, because now my mixes will sound better. Anyway, when the pandemic hit, we started having remote church. We recorded the whole service, and everybody had to stay home, unfortunately. And also during that time, I started sending out a daily email to encourage people. I wanted to encourage my fellow musicians and also the people that were in my small group in church. And so there was a group of about 15, 20 people, and I would send out a daily email with some words of encouragement and also some things about music. I would introduce them to composers that I thought were interesting, play them some pieces that I thought they would really enjoy hearing, talked about music history, music appreciation, and I just did that pretty much every day. I called it Music for Today, and it was just a daily email that I sent out during the pandemic when everybody was stuck at home. Well, I found out that one of my fellow musicians at the church was a homeschool teacher and was using my emails as part of her curriculum to teach her children everything about music appreciation, a little bit of music theory. And it got me thinking, maybe that's something that I can do for other homeschool families. I know that music is an important part of a child's education. I believe that it should be. It certainly was in my education. I remember when I was in grammar school, we all had a bunch of glockenspiels that we got to play, and we got to play auto harps and percussion instruments and learning about music. We even learned how to read music in a rudimentary way in public school. Of course, this was in the 60s. I don't know what it's like now in the whatever you call this decade, the 20s, the new 20s. Anyway, I found out she was using my emails, the material that were in my emails, to be part of her homeschool curriculum. And so I thought, what if I start a YouTube channel that can help homeschool parents teach all things music to their children? And I talked to her about it, and she thought it was a good idea. I consulted with a couple of other homeschool teachers that I knew, and they thought this is good. This is a group of people that could use your help. Now, I know that there's a lot of music curriculums out there for homeschool families, and many of them are quite good. But I thought, what could be different about At Home with Music? Well, it's a constantly developing curriculum. In other words, anything or everything that's on my site now is not everything that will ever be there. It's constantly growing. I try to add 2 to 3 new videos a week. Some of them are music appreciation. Some of them are about composers, both obscure and famous. Some of them are, a lot of them are about technique for learning to play keyboard. And so a homeschool teacher, even someone who doesn't consider themselves a musician, can take the things that they learn from the videos and pass that on to their children. So that's the whole idea behind At Home with Music. Now, interestingly enough, not only are my videos being watched by homeschoolers, but I've also found by going through my YouTube analytics that there are a lot of older folks who are also looking at my videos and using them to teach themselves to play keyboard, to learn the basics of music theory. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But I've always loved teaching. Now, I've been a performer since the early 70s. In fact, my first professional job was when I was 13 years old. I became a church organist, which is kind of funny because I'm not really an organ player. But I also got a chance to play the piano too. And I've been performing pretty much ever since. Nowadays, my performing is limited to playing in the worship band, or the worship team, if you like, at our church. So I get to sit back there behind the grand piano and play along, and I enjoy that very much. And it's been a real blessing to be a part of that. But I've always, as well as being a performer, always enjoyed teaching as well. And I really started teaching seriously right around the time that I started my recording studio in the early 90s. The home recording became a pretty big thing back then, and I became an independent record producer as well as a performer. But the teacher in me, and I should mention that in the church, I was a Bible teacher as well. I've taught many Bible studies in several of the different churches in which I've been involved. And so teaching has always been something that I've really enjoyed, I really have a passion for, teaching music. Now, in my studio in the early 90s, I worked with a lot of beginning artists, or emerging artists, I like to call them. These were folks that had a real passion for songwriting and performing, but yet they had never done any professional recording, or maybe they had tried to do a professional recording and had a bad experience. Maybe they were working with a producer that just wouldn't listen to them and tried to make them into a country artist when they were really an R&B musician. But many of them were very interested in the ins and outs of multi-track recording. I started out using cassette tapes in the very old days, and then we moved on to using MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, and then started using digital tape. And now, of course, just like a lot of studios, I'm recording in Pro Tools. But a lot of the musicians that I worked with said, well, what are you doing here? And how does this work? And why are we doing this? and teacher mode would kick in, and I would try to explain to them as best I could why we were doing what we were doing. But in addition to talking about recording, I was also doing a lot of arranging for them because I'm a keyboard player. I was producing a lot of the tracks, sometimes playing all the instruments using samples and so on. But I would explain, okay, here's why this guitar part will sound good here. And these are why I use these particular chords. I often had singer-songwriters come in who wrote words, they wrote melodies, but they couldn't really play an instrument well enough to accompany themselves. And so they would come in and just sing me their melodies, just a cappella. And I would write down, because I'm classically trained and have a degree in music theory and composition. I've, a lot of good teachers. I was able to write down what they wrote and then put chords to it and then create an accompaniment. And they were sometimes kind of amazed at what they were able to come up with when they wrote these songs. I said, gosh, I didn't know I was that good. But that's what an arranger can do. And I would be teaching them at the same time, here's how we can improve that melody a little bit. Here's why I used the chords that I used. And I was kind of teaching at the same time I was producing. It just came naturally to me. And also for a while, I taught group piano lessons. I did this in the early 2000s during a break from live performing. I left the society band I was in 2002, and then in 2006, I started working with Sybil Gage and got back into live performing again. But during that interim, I taught group piano lessons. So I would be going into recreation centers or colleges or universities, and they would bring in, a group of people would sign up, and I would start them from the very beginning. I'd usually start out by asking, how many of you have ever taken piano lessons? And just about everybody would raise their hand. And then I would ask, how many of you are still taking piano lessons? And nobody would raise their hand. And so we started from the basics. I taught them how to read notes, basically the treble clef. And then I taught them how to play chords on the piano. We started with something simple like the C major chord and the F major chord and the G major chord. And then we would learn how to play melodies and play the chords in the left hand. And that's how it started. It's a combination of learning to read the notes off the page, but also playing by ear. It's called the popular method, and I talk about that a lot in some of my other videos. And so I really enjoyed teaching that. I would have as many as 20, sometimes 30 people in the classroom, and they would all have a little cardboard cutout keyboard where they could practice where they put their fingers. And then during the break, they could come up, they'd all crowd around the keyboard and try it on the keyboard itself. Now, I was very fortunate in my musical education. I had some wonderful teachers. I have a video where my dad tells the story of how I got started taking piano lessons. So I'll link to that in the description of this when it goes, when there's the replay on YouTube. I'll put that in there. It's basically Dad tells the story. And I videotaped my 93-year-old father sitting in his easy chair. He didn't even know I was recording him at the time. I just asked him to talk about how I got started playing the piano and the first piano he brought into the house, and eventually the first teacher that I had. And so he'll tell you that story, and it's a lot more fun listening to him tell it. He tends to embellish the details a little bit because he is my dad, but nevertheless, it's a lot of fun to listen to him. Anyway, my first teacher was a young woman named Eleanor Giacoletti. I don't know if she's going to watch this video, but I'm going to embarrass her. She was a wonderful teacher. And I think one of the greatest things about her was that she didn't try, I don't know if she remembers it this way, but this is what she did. She gave me the freedom to explore what I really wanted to do as a musician. Now, naturally, I needed to learn the treble clef and the bass clef, and I had to play my scales, and I had to learn little pieces, I can't even remember. That's a little piece that Mozart wrote probably when he was about 5. And I had to learn that. The very first piano piece I learned was called The Donkey, just one hand. Anyway, I blazed through all the books that she gave me, but she also encouraged me as far as what I also wanted to do, not just to be a performer, which I enjoyed. I gave my first recital about 6 months after I started taking lessons. I also wanted to write music. And in fact, in the very first recital, I wrote a little piece. It wasn't very good. It was a little theme and variations, so that was the theme. And then I would go, like try to get really fancy, and I put the fancy arpeggios in there. And that was my attempt at being a composer. Well, she sent me to another teacher, a gentleman named Eugene Hemmer, who was known around that area in the South Bay area of California at the time as a composer, and he taught composition. And so I ended up studying with him. And then she saw that I really wanted to develop my technique so that I could play more difficult pieces. And so she sent me to another teacher. His name was James Lynch. And he used to encourage me to practice 4 hours a day or more. And so I did. Yeah, worked really hard. And then I had a good teacher in college. Her name was Rosemary Heiler. And she was only a few years older than me. But nonetheless, she encouraged me to learn some pieces that were a little bit harder than I was used to. And so I had to, once again, practice hard, stretch myself, and expand my boundaries as a musician. I was also influenced by a couple of comedian piano players, one of them being Victor Borge. If you've never watched anything by Victor Borge, I believe he is one of the funniest people who ever lived. And so you need to search him out on YouTube. You can actually hear him speaking in whatever they speak in Denmark. Good Lord, I should know what language that is. Anyway, but he also, of course, he was funny in 2 languages, which is an amazing thing. English was actually his second language, which he didn't learn until he was an adult. But he did a lot of funny routines, but he was also an extremely accomplished pianist, a fabulous musician. And the other piano player that I thought was hilarious was Chico Marx. Now, some people pronounce his name Chico. It's not Chico, it's Chico. And maybe someday I'll tell you the story behind how he got his name. But he used to do in fact, I did a YouTube short where I pretended to be Chico Marx playing Mozart. Actually, he would have played it like this. Well, anyway, obviously I did not incorporate that style of playing very much in my classical recitals, of which I did several during my classical training. I studied classical piano from the time I was 12 until the time I was 22. And so I am a thoroughly trained musician. I also had an excellent teacher in college who taught me music theory. His name was George Hoysenstam, and I believe he's still alive today. I really should. I know I found him on Facebook. He's in his 90s now, and he had such an enthusiasm for the subject of music theory, and I also studied counterpoint with him. And what used to amaze me was I would, for example, write out a piece of counterpoint for an assignment, and then he would correct it in red ink. And then he would take some blank staff paper that might have been left over on the assignment and write out something in ink and say, "What do you think about this?" And he would write out a little example of what I could have done. And I'm thinking, my goodness, that's amazing. So my knowledge of music theory, the ability to hear how chords go together, how music works. That's basically all music theory is just learning how music works. Then that's it. That's what I learned from George Hoistenstamm. Now let's see. I should see if anybody is watching this here. Let's see. Somebody says, "Hey, what up, Captain?" From Bulldag. Hey, what's up, man? I'm talking about what I really love, and that's teaching music. Of course, performing comes a close second, but I have a lot of stuff that I enjoy sharing with folks. Anyway, my music theory professor was great. I also had a couple of people that served as teachers, but weren't really teaching me. And let me explain. Um, from 1990 until 2002, I had an agent that I worked with. His name is Len Turner. God rest his soul. I miss him dearly. But that was my introduction. Up to the time I worked with Len, I was playing mainly rock and roll, quietly, of course. I was playing pop music. I was playing church music, mostly hymns, worship songs, and so on. And when I started working with Len, he put me into country clubs and yacht clubs and private parties. This was in Florida, up and down the Space Coast and the Treasure Coast. And I had to learn to play standards, the Great American Songbook. I'd learned to play something like this. Learn just basically cocktail piano, if you like. And I had never played music like that before. I had dabbled with the Great American Songbook because my dad loved those old songs. He had me playing things like, well, that's not really suitable for a country club. Maybe if I played it like this. But anyway, so he didn't actually sit me down and say, "Now, Leon, here's how you play standards." I learned it by doing. I listened to a lot of different folks, listened to people like George Shearing, um, Keith Jarrett, Oscar Peterson, who made me want to quit because he plays so many notes, it's unbelievable. But nevertheless, um, Bill Evans, I would listen to him and just try to learn. All right, use my ear. I have absolute pitch. I was able to figure out, okay, what are these guys doing? And by listening and trying to absorb what they did, I began to learn how to play that style of music. And then I was in his band, Len Turner's band, and learned how to accompany or how to really work with accompanying a vocalist, his wife, Jan. Are you watching, Jan? Hope I don't embarrass you. She was a wonderful singer, a great showwoman. Showwoman? She really knew how to communicate with an audience. And I learned how to accompany her, how to be part of a band, how to play with other musicians. I worked with some really great musicians during my time with Len Turner, great drummers, bass players, other singers, guitarists, a lot of wonderful musicians that I got to meet through my time with him. Then, as I mentioned, I took a few years off from live performing. That's when I taught the live piano classes. Then I started working with a New Orleans jazz singer named Sybil Gage. Now, I might be embarrassing Sybil too, but I have so many fond memories of working with her. Now, once again, I had to learn a different style of music. She did some standards, but she was also doing New Orleans jazz. And so now I was listening to people like Professor Longhair and Dr. John. And gosh, I'm trying to think of a few others. Pine Top, all these guys that played that style of music. And she gave me the freedom to figure it out. She never once sat me down and said, "Now, here's how you do it." What she did do was give me suggestions as to who I might listen to, or she would give me a recording and say, "Here's a song that I want to do. I don't want to do it exactly like this, but I want something in that style." And so I would listen to it and once again, figure out how to do it. But she also ended up we wanted to do things. We did some rock tunes. I did a piano version of the Rolling Stones song Beast of Burden. She taught me or allowed me to learn how to play boogie woogie. There is a video of me playing House of Blue Lights on YouTube. You can look that up, Sybil Gage, House of Blue Lights, and you'll hear me play boogie woogie. And I was adequate, perhaps not the greatest boogie woogie player in the world, but for an old classically trained pianist who didn't learn to play jazz until he was nearly 50, not too bad. But once again, I was given the freedom to expand my horizons as a musician. And that's what I aim to do for folks who watch my videos on At Home with Music, is to expand your musical horizons, give you the tools you need to develop as a musician, to expand your repertoire, as it were. And, I was communicating with a fellow on YouTube recently, and he was mentioning that, it gets a little bit frustrating. You don't feel like you're making the progress that you'd like to be making. But his teacher gave him a good word of wisdom. He said, enjoy the journey and the results will come. Maybe patience is not your long suit, but there's really no other way to develop as a musician. And I'm still learning. There are definitely things I still want to learn how to do. Of course, I'm learning my way around YouTube, learning how to do live streams, learning how to communicate with people. And of course, my real desire is to find out what you want to learn, what would be of the most help to you. And as I mentioned, that's what I believe sets At Home with Music apart. Yes, it's in a sense a music curriculum. I'm working on developing accompanying materials that will be available to those of you who choose to support me on Patreon. But it's always expanding. And I always want to be responsive to any suggestions or questions that you might have. In fact, there are several videos on my channel that are there as a result of somebody in the comment section saying, hey, what about this? Or why don't you talk about this? And I would do it. I should have written down what some of those specific things were. Anyway, so my plan for the channel, of course, is to continue adding new videos, more advanced music theory things, more things about music history, explore the work and lives of some famous composers and some of the more obscure ones. In my research, I found there's a lot of composers who have written a lot of interesting music that many of it has fallen into obscurity, and some of it deservedly so. Those could be fun to listen to, but some of it undeservedly, I think. And so it could be a case of they just weren't that well known. They toiled in obscurity even in their lifetime, or they didn't write as much music. I mean, Beethoven wrote a huge pile of music. Mozart did. Haydn, over 100 symphonies Haydn wrote, tons of stuff. But some of these more obscure composers, maybe they only had one or two really great works in their catalog, but they're worth exploring. I think you'll find a lot of interesting things in there. And I hope to get out of the studio from time to time and do some videos where we might go somewhere to talk about music, talk to other musicians, just see what's out there. And as I mentioned, I'm always looking for suggestions. Let's see. I got the computer set up way too far away, and my eyesight is not good. Cheryl Olguin, hey, that's my wife. She says, "What's an obscure piece you like? An obscure composer you'd recommend?" Well, I'll tell you one that I'd recommend off the top of my head is Carl Czerny. I just finished a video on him, it was a few weeks ago. And it's the first one in my series on obscure composers. The great thing about Czerny is not only was he a great composer, he was also a tremendous teacher. And in fact, he is more well known for his exercises, the piano exercises. He wrote The School of Velocity and The Art of Finger Dexterity. And some of these pieces are pretty wild. And you can look them up on YouTube. There are some people who have basically made YouTube channels of playing through these various exercises where he takes you through scales and arpeggios and octaves and repeated notes and all kinds of crazy things. But he also wrote just regular compositions. There's a famous piano sonata that's on YouTube. It's his sonata in B minor. I would encourage you to check that out. He also wrote songs and he wrote choral music, and he's an unjustly neglected composer. He had his fans. Liszt liked his music and included some of it in his concert repertoires. And Brahms was also a fan of Czerny. And of course, I just mentioned Czerny studied with Beethoven. He was one of Beethoven's students, but he was Liszt's teacher. So what an amazing chain that is, to have studied with one of the world's greatest composers and then have been the teacher of one of the world's other greatest composers slash pianists. Anyway, that's what I've got going on. Music has been a real blessing to me. And that's why I love to teach music. Obviously, I don't expect all of my students, maybe very few of them, maybe none of them, to pursue a career in music. I did, and it's been, shall we say, a wild ride full of ups and downs. And takes a kind of I don't know, I don't want to congratulate myself for being a professional musician. There are definitely days when I wish I'd been an accountant or something like that. But I can't complain, because I still have the joy of passing on the knowledge that I've gained over 50 years of being a professional musician and a teacher. I have the privilege and the honor of passing on that information to you here on YouTube. So I think that about wraps it up here for my first live stream. I hope to come back, do this again, and hopefully get to see more of you here. But I thank those of you who have taken the time to watch this. And if you're watching this on the replay, thank you very much. I hope you found this helpful and enjoyable. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave those in the comment section below. And I answer every comment that I receive. And I look forward to hearing from you. So, by the way, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, don't forget to do that as well. I will talk to you in the next one. I'm going to end the live stream right now.